Everybody take a deep breath. We've been talking about how we connect with God in the world. This series that we've been doing is called, what is this series called? Grounded, thank you. I lost my grounding. This series is called Grounding, Finding God in the World. And we've had, this is our fourth Sunday, I think, or maybe our fourth or fifth. We started with soil, dirt, finding our grounding in dirt. But not just dirt, this idea of simply being grounded in life around us, that we find life in the midst of where we are moment by moment. This Elizabeth Barrett Browning idea of all the earth is crammed with heaven and every common bush aflame with God's fire. And those who see take off their shoes, but the others simply sit by and pick blueberries. This idea that we live in the midst of the holy. And what does that really mean? And then we talked about water. And we talked about, I told stories about water scenes, but all of these various scenes in our lives, all these places we find ourselves, we look for threads sometimes. We look to make sense out of this as though God is sort of removed and directing our lives a little bit somehow. And there's a thread in all of this, that God's plan is moving us in a certain direction. And then we try really hard to see what's the point of all of this. But then that word that I taught you all, kadosh, that word holy, the ground is holy, kadosh. Everything is holy. And you start drawing circles around these holy moments because all these moments are holy. And then you start realizing they all begin to intersect. And sooner than later, you begin to realize the whole thing is encircled by kadosh. Kadosh, this idea, all of the earth crammed with heaven. All of the earth proclaiming God's glory. And then last week, Charles Gaby was here, back visiting with us, our former initiator and founder and leader, and sharing with us the idea of roots, of being how we are rooted. But he also talked about the way in which those roots sometimes preclude or presume a way of looking at the world. We're sort of sometimes born with these, the way we're raised, we have these neural network sort of patterns, we have these scripts, we have these ideas that somehow we didn't necessarily initiate, but we were born into them in many ways. And some of our earliest understandings of who God is or how we see God. And so we're really continuing that today with this idea of sky, because what I want to talk to you about in a very brief, rudimentary way, but hopefully something that will kick off your thinking, is cosmology. How do we think about our being in the world? And how do we think about where God is in the world? Cosmology is sort of the way in which we look at the universe, the whole cosmos, and how we have formed that vision, where that came from, where it is now for us. And so I want to suggest some thoughts based on both our text today and on this series. But I first want to figure out, maybe I should tell you a story. It's one of my favorite stories, and I probably have told it here years ago, but it's by James Thurber, a story called The Moth and the Star. There was once a very impressionable young moth who one evening set his heart on a distant star. It seemed to be calling his very name as if it was simply hung at the top of an elm tree, hanging from a branch. And so he would flutter with all of his might and effort until early the next morning he would come back home exhausted from his vain endeavor. His family would look at him and ask him, "Where have you been?" And he would say, "I was out searching that star, seeking that star." His father would look at him and say, "Why are you wasting your time on stars? Moths don't fly after stars. Moths fly after street lamps. They don't go anywhere. You can easily find them." But the young moth was not appeased by that. Instead, every evening he continued to flutter to his greatest extent to try to reach the star, which was in fact 22 million light years away. And yet to him it seemed only hung at the top of that tree. And so he continued and would come back exhausted. One day his father lost his temper and he said, "Boy, I told you moths are supposed to be chasing street lights, car lights. You should be out there getting burned." But the young boy once again did not heed his father's demands and instead continued after that star. Night after night, day after day coming home exhausted. Until after some time, the young moth began to feel as though he actually had reached that star. Something in him had changed, and he began telling all the other stars just as much that he had reached that star. And as it turns out, that young moth lived to a ripe old age. His friends and his mother and father were burned to death or crushed by a car or a street lamp. But he lived a ripe old age. And the moral of the story is, when you flee those fixed realms and spheres of sorrow, more often than not, you are here today and also tomorrow. So, this idea of cosmology, it's just at the top. It's just right there. I can almost touch it. That star, I can see it so clearly. The ancients often thought of the world as being enveloped in a big globe, right? A big dome. And so the dome on the top, which they called the waters above or the heavens above, was a solid dome. And down there, and the waters below were sort of what we didn't know, but was what beneath us. And then what we did know was what we saw here, the realm present. So we had the waters above and the waters below. And this idea of cosmology was how we sort of figured out why we're here. It was the best way we could figure out what our purpose might be, living within the confines of this fixed understanding. And then when we saw the stars up there, it was a great mystery of how these things happen. After all, everything revolved around us, right? And so when things would suddenly appear, and after a while they became sort of familiar, at least for time, and then would change with seasons, but they became familiar, so we'd make up stories about them. And we try to figure out exactly how they relate to us and how we relate to them and how that explains the way things are here. F. Forrest Church, who was a late writer and theologian and the minister of All Souls Church in New York, he once wrote that religion is our human response to the dual reality of being born unwittingly and then having to die. Religion is the human response to that dual reality of being born and having to die. Now that seems a bit strong perhaps, or maybe a little too narrow. But as you start looking at the history of how we've told stories over time, they've always revolved around these existential questions. Why am I here? What's my purpose? How'd things get to be the way they are? What are we supposed to be? What's our future? And all that we had to go on was what we could see with our eyes. And so for thousands of years, we painted on cave walls, and then eventually we wrote down stories, and then eventually we codified those tales, and then those tales became institutionalized, and then eventually we found ourselves in the 21st century. We didn't ask to be born, but we're here. In whatever life circumstances we found ourselves, and with whatever resources or lack thereof at our disposal as we grew up, and eventually before we know it, we come face to face with our finitude. So maybe you did this as a kid, and I'll confess that I did this as a kid. I found myself living out my life like a reality TV show. Of course, we didn't have reality TV shows back then when I was a kid. If we did, I know mine would have been a really successful one. I know I had a really interesting life. And I always knew there was an audience, right? I don't know if you did this as a kid. You always sort of imagined that there's that sort of audience. For a while there, it was just sort of an ambiguous audience. But after I got involved with the Baptist church, it was a very big, singular audience who was always sort of looking down, sometimes judgmentally, sometimes benevolently, but oftentimes more judgmentally. So I always was sort of like making choices and decisions and then regretting choices and decisions and then fearing for my afterlife because of my choices and my decisions. And it was all because of the big audience in the sky that was watching me. And it reminded me of the Twilight Zone episode. I don't know if you guys ever watched Twilight Zone, but there was that wonderful Twilight. Rod Serling had so many of these themes that pretty much were all in all of his episodes. But one of my favorite was called The Little People, where you come and you realize you're in this village or this little town, and all the people are just people, normal people. And then all of a sudden you realize there's these giants who are sort of manipulating everything. These giants, there's two of them, and they sort of like run the whole town. They're manipulating things without the little people knowing until they run into into them. And then at the very end of the episode, after the little people have discovered the giants, you see the two giants radioing back to Earth and saying, they've discovered who we are. They were just earthlings now running a small civilization. It kind of similar to the Truman Show. If you watch the Truman Show, when Truman finally bumps up against the outer shell of this massive studio that his show is taking place in, and then he hears the voice saying, Truman, and he hollers out and says, is that you, God? And the guy says, no, I'm the director of this show. And that's when Truman, of course, realized what he's always suspected, perhaps all along, was that there's something else happening here, and I don't get it. And then he opens the door and leaves into a new world. For thousands of years, our cosmology and our way of understanding the sky as this three-tiered reality has made sense. For thousands of years, it's made sense. And even with Plato, and oddly enough, Plato and Aristotle and then Socrates, who oddly enough held to both this very concrete, defined understanding of cosmology, while at the same time Socrates practiced this self-critical review or self-critical orientation to everything that was so novel for his time and has become sort of instrumental in much of our self-critical thinking to this day. He had that dual reality going on in his own orientation, questioning everything. What got him in a great deal of trouble, of course. But this understanding existed until Copernicus, and then until Galileo, and then eventually with Newton. And all of these things progressively began to move us from this understanding of we are no longer geocentric, but now we are heliocentric. We're no longer the center of the universe. Now we revolve around the sun. And now our galaxy is not the universe. As Galileo discovered, now we're not the universe. In fact, we're just a solar system within one universe. And then, of course, in the 21st century now, within multiple universes, perhaps. Universes of billions and billions of stars and galaxies. And then we come to Einstein and the theory of relativity. And there's this interesting idea that things aren't as they seem still, right? Even Einstein at the end of his life, starting to question relativity and the meaning of all of that. Tim, one of my sons, I'm here with my other son who's in the back with my little granddaughter. I don't think Eleanor has been here in worship before. Hello, Eleanor. So that's kind of sweet. She and I will have a competition going on here in a minute. But our other son, Tim, I remember when we were up in a jet and we were flying, and I think we were going to New York, and I remember Tim was sitting there with Linda and me, and she had the window seat, and he was looking out over this bed of clouds, this big bank of clouds, and then he saw these massive clouds kind of rising up in sort of almost a figure-like shape. I mean, if you used your imagination, you could sort of almost see a figure in this sort of massive thundercloud that was rising dark above the white clouds. And then in the distance behind it, you would literally saw the beams of light shooting up right from the sun that had already started to set. So it had this angelic, heavenly sort of look to it. And Tim was just staring at it. And this painting of beautiful colors of orange and pink and blues behind all of that with the light shining through and beyond the clouds. And Tim looked over and he said, "It's God. God has painted the sky and is playing in a field of cotton." And we thought, what a beautiful idea. What a beautiful image. But where do we get these ideas that God is in the sky? Where do we get these notions still that if we say, so how's things going with you? And you say, well, things are going pretty good. Someone up there must like me. Or I was at an event over the weekend and I heard someone giving thanks, and saying, well, my mother, she would often spend time with the big guy above. And I'm thinking, what guy above? I mean, I get it, right? We all get it. We all understand, even in our most concrete efforts at trying to sort of pin down who God is, we still speak in metaphor, right? We still do that. It's the most comfortable thing that we do. But the challenge for us is, when we're thinking cosmology, is that sometimes we have to challenge our very metaphors to move us into that next phase of how we think about God, into that next bigger phase, perhaps, of how we think about cosmology and our place in creation. And that's where I think we are in the challenge of the 21st century as we think about sky, as we think about how we connect to God in the world. What does that even mean? How do we even begin to do that, to get past all of that sort of 3rd century, 1st century, 5th century BC cosmology in light of 21st century cosmology and quantum physics? How do we get there? Einstein wrote his daughter Liesl, I can't say her name, but it's Liesl, that's her name. But he wrote his daughter a letter, and it was about 5 years before he died. And it was really interesting when I found this online, because I'd heard Einstein talk about how we are all interconnected, and one of the greatest aspects of our science discovery is our interconnectedness with life, our interconnectedness with all of creation, our interconnectedness, interdependency with one another is one of what he thought was one of the great discoveries that we had yet to really own, that we still live in this very dualistic, very compartmentalized way of looking at each other. I understood that, but I didn't realize that he had written this letter. I'm going to read most of it to you. Dear Liesl, when I proposed the theory of relativity, very few understood me. And what I will reveal now to you to transmit to all humankind will also collide with much misunderstanding and prejudice in the world, I fear. So I ask you to guard this letter as long as necessary, years, decades if necessary, until society is advanced enough to what I will explain to you below. There is an extremely powerful force that so far science has not found a formal explanation for. It is a force that includes and governs all others and is even behind any phenomenon operating in the universe that has yet not been identified by us. And what is this universal force? It is love. When scientists look for a unified theory of the universe, they forgot the most powerful unseen force. Love enlightens those who give and receive it. Love is like gravity because it makes people feel attracted to others. Love is like power because it multiplies the best we have and allows humanity not to be extinguished by their blind selfishness. Love unfolds and love reveals. For love we live, for love we die. Love is God. This force explains everything and gives meaning to life. It's the variable that we have ignored far too long, maybe because we are afraid of love, because it's the only energy in the universe that humanity has not learned to drive at will. To give visibility to love, I made a simple substitution from my most famous equation. If instead of E equals mc squared, we accept that the energy to heal the world can be attained through love multiplied by the speed of light squared, then we arrive at the conclusion that love can be the most powerful force and would have no limit. After the failure of humanity in the use and control of the other force of the universe, it is urgent that we nourish ourselves with another kind of energy. Then he underlined this. If we want our species to survive, if we are to find meaning in life, if we want to save the world and every sentient being in it, then love is the one and only answer. Perhaps we are not ready to make a bomb of love, a device powerful enough to entirely destroy hate and selfishness and greed, which is why perhaps we need to wait before this can be read, lest it become trivialized the way my other theory has become. However, each individual carries within them a small, powerful generator of love whose energy is waiting to be released. When we learn to give and receive this energy, dear Liesl, we will have affirmed that love can conquer all and is able to transcend everything because it is the quintessential element of life. There was there's a writer and a philosopher by the name of Don Cupid. He's a theological philosopher. He's retired now, but he wrote something that I found really interesting when he said that we are at a place in our history where we are in the midst of a spiritual revolution, a cosmological revolution. In some of the same ways in which we've experienced civil rights, We experience it sort of spirally, where we make these progressive moves forward, and then we have these backlashes with the feminist movement, with women's rights. We have this progressive move forward, and then we have this sort of backlash. With theology and the liberal theology of the 60s, the 50s, we have this sort of move forward into exploring new ideas, and then we have this backlash, this sort of pushback, because all of change is a bit threatening, right? It's always challenging. So instead of love, we tend to revolve around fear. Instead of embracing change and mystery, we tend to try to control it. 95% of the universe is mystery. It's run by dark matter and dark energy. It's held together somehow, and it expands somehow. And yet we continue to try to revolve around, to revolve our cosmologies around our small understanding and define it that way. So Cupid writes that the real challenge for the future will not be a Christianity that continues to sort of hang on ancient cosmology, but a Christianity that, like Einstein, begins to recognize that the real powerful force that moves life forward is love. The powerful force that moves life in a healing way. As I talked about salvation 2 weeks ago and said that salvation, the word for salvation, is wholeness and completeness. Not the removal of something in our lives, not the removal of a stain in our life, not Augustine's understanding of we were created evil and we fell from our grace and now we've got to find our way back. We were created beautifully, and yet we have still trouble accepting that and living out of that. But that is that force of love. For God so loved the cosmos. The word for world is cosmos. For God so loved the cosmos that God gave love incarnate into the world so that the world might be healed, might become whole. Einstein was onto something that Christ incarnated in the world 2,000 years before. That has been a message there from the very beginning, but we haven't had the minds to get to it. So I'm just going to suggest to you that we're in this service right now, talking about something that 50 years from now, if you're around, some of the kids who might still be around, right? They're going to look back and go, yeah, that guy was talking about that at 11:11. I remember that. Christianity isn't at all like it used to be. But now we're living out of this love that we're supposed to be living out of. This love that is inclusive, this love that is open-armed, that opens arms to everyone, this love that loves enemies, that loves mystery, that loves dark matter, that loves dark energy, that loves to live into the question with compassion. That's what Christianity will look like in the future. Amen.
There's a rainbow in the sky all the time. Don't be blind. There's a rainbow in the sky all the time. Don't be blind. Don't be blind. Say I'm living in my fantasy. But is you are blinded from reality. The material world means so much to you. You just can't get what I'm telling you. There's a rainbow in the sky all the time. Don't be blind. Don't be blind. There's a rainbow in the sky all the time. Don't be blind. Don't be blind. 'Cause in it dark of sorrow there was joy. Yeah. Yes, and there I met the veilless ear. lost emotions, the egosphere. My life is full of colors, yeah, my mind is clear. There's a rainbow in the sky, rainbow in the sky. Found down mercy in every sunrise. I am born again from the womb of nights. Yeah, all I have, I've left behind. Mind's eyes, I see a light will shine. There's a rainbow in the sky all the time. Don't be blind, don't be blind. There's a rainbow in the sky all the time. Don't be blind, don't be blind. Hey. There's a rainbow in the sky. Ooh. A rainbow in the sky. Oh, there's a rainbow in the sky. Oh, oh, there's a rainbow in the sky. Yeah.
Well, let me invite everyone to stand. We'll have a blessing together. I loved what Sharm was saying earlier, sharing these moments of mission and outreach and activity and participation. There's so many things that our church is doing out in the community. I was reading somewhere recently, I'll just make a quick thought here. I was reading somewhere recently where someone described the church in 50 years and said that the church will be, that whereas it now is 100 people in attendance with 20 people running things and 30 people volunteering, the church of the future will be 100 people in attendance, 100 people as members, maybe 100 people in attendance, and then 400 people out working in the community. I think once we recognize that the real powerful force that we have in God is this power of love, we become transformative. Let us pray. Bless us, Holy One, as we leave this place, as we seek to find our connections in the world, as we seek to touch the sky by touching one another. We pray this in the name of whom we live and move and have our being. Amen.
Don't be blind. There's a rainbow in the sky all the time. Don't be blind. Don't be blind. I shot the Don't be blind. Hey. There's a rainbow in the sky all the time. Don't be blind. Don't be blind.